world of military aviation, one aircraft rules supreme. Built to put American pilots back in charge of the skies, it is the ultimate air fighter, able to climb to the height of Mount Everest in just 60 seconds.
Oh, the F-15E is an absolute dream to fly. It was so exhilarating and so sexy and just incredible.
It proved its value in both Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom, flying thousands of successful missions against Saddam Hussein's forces. This jet was at the front of the strike force, its role to sweep enemy aircraft out of the skies.
I thought it was absolutely magnificent.
With firepower second to none and the maneuverability to outfly its opponents, its track record is astounding. Over 100 air-to-air kills for no losses. Not one single aircraft has been lost in air-to-air combat in over 30 years of service. Whoever controls the F-15 controls the skies.
It's the greatest airplane in the world.
Using extraordinary archive film and color reenactments, heavy metal flies into battle with the F-15 Eagle. January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm. American air attacks in Iraq are poised to begin. Flying at the front of a great wave of coalition aircraft are 20 F-15 fighters. Over 40 miles into Iraq, their radar picks up enemy contacts. Captain John Kelk leads the flight of F-15s. He is the first to hear the radar warning tone in his headset. Enemy fighters are targeting his plane.
You got someone locked, interrogate, bandit.
Kelk is not sure the aircraft ahead are hostile, but as the jets close in at over 1,400 miles per hour, the F-15 pilot must decide, should he shoot to kill? His radar shows a fighter flying aggressively towards him, so he prepares for combat. Closing his eyes to protect his vision from the anticipated explosion, he slams the pickle button on his stick, launching an air-to-air missile. Seconds later, an orange explosion lights up the night sky. Kelk has become the first American to score an air-to-air kill in the F-15. 30 years of planning have finally paid off. But the F-15 story begins decades earlier, deep in the Cold War years. In 1951, the Korean War is raging. American F-86 Sabre pilots fight pitched battles with Russian MiGs. These American pilots first learned their dogfighting skills during the dark days of World War II. In Korea, they achieve an alleged kill ratio of 10-to-1 against the Soviets.
10-to-1 kill ratio that the F-86 had seemed to be something that was to be aspired to, but would never be matched, which seemed to be the benchmark. I mean, it was like Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs in a season. I mean, who is ever going to break that record?
Once again, the Sabres have proven more than a match for the Red Jets. Chalk up another for the Sabres with no losses of their own.
By the Vietnam War, U.S. Air Force fighter pilots are flying F-4 Phantoms against a new generation of Soviet-built MiGs. USAF planners decide the new aircraft should fight at great distances using guided missiles. They believe the age of the dogfight is over. But missiles don't always find their targets. In fact, only 14% of the first AIM-7 missiles ever hit anything. And when the Phantom's missiles fail, the fighter is left completely defenseless. The F-4 has no gun.
A fighter that doesn't have weapons isn't a fighter. And the issue with the F-4 in Vietnam, though, was that the Sparrow, the radar-guided missile, and the Sidewinder, the heat-seeking missile that the airplane carried, were designed to be shot against large bomber-sized targets at high altitude. When you take a system designed, optimized for that, and then employ it against small fighter-sized targets, highly maneuvering at lower altitudes, the results are not pretty, and they weren't pretty for us.
Soviet MiGs flown by Vietnamese lure F-4s in close, knowing they are soft targets. But the American pilots are not trained to dogfight. That knowledge from World War II and Korea has not been passed down to this generation of fighter pilots.
The training that I had to go to Vietnam was abysmal. And the new pilots that came into their organizations that were supposed to be there to go fly air to air and dogfight with the MiGs, the training was not even as good as abysmal. It was just, in fact, non-existent.
The American F-4s and their pilots are left dangerously exposed.
If you're an F-4 pilot in the midst of a dogfight, you've used up your radar missiles, they all missed, which they always did, and then you fired a few of your infrared missiles, and by bad luck or because you didn't have a good position, they missed. Now you're out of ideas and out of ammunition, and you better go home because you're in trouble. They're going to get you unless you can get out of there because you don't even have a gun to fall back on.
The F-4 had originally been designed to down nuclear bombers. When pushed into a dogfight, its limitations are all too clear.
The F-4, like almost all the airplanes that were designed to be electronic radar interceptors, had horrible visibility because the designers were totally focused on somebody with his head down in the radar scope, either the pilot or the guy behind him doing that. And all you needed windows for was to take off and land because the radar was going to be your eyes. Well, that's a quick way to a quick death in combat because the guy who kills you is never out front. He's always the guy who's behind you.
These mistakes prove costly. Over 3,000 American aircraft are lost.
For a good part of the war, we didn't get much better than 1-to-1 exchange ratio, which all things considered was a disgrace. The Air Force took it as a disgrace, and it was a disgrace.
Air Force planners know they need a new aircraft, the ultimate dogfighting machine. A plane that can achieve air superiority in any theater of action. 500 designs are submitted for the FX Fighter Experimental Program. But Air Force chiefs are not impressed.
The 500 designs that were returned from the first request for proposal were all rejected because they simply did not break the mold.
The Air Force urgently needs to regain the aviation advantage. Unexpected developments in Russia suggest they are losing the race. At the 1967 Moscow Air Show, the Soviets unveiled their next generation fighter, the MiG-25 Foxbat.
It would have looked to the intelligence analysts as though this was a force to be reckoned with. It would certainly have put the fear of God into them because you've got an aeroplane that can fly at up to Mach 3, that can climb to 60, 70,000 feet, and that is easily going to be able to chase down and beat any fighter that the Americans had to put up against it.
The race is now on to build an American plane that can outfight the Soviet MiG. Little does anyone know, the result will change military history forever. After losing the aviation advantage to the Soviet MiG-25, American aircraft designers go back to the drawing board. Planners must recruit somebody who really understands fighter planes. They need a guy with hands-on experience of aerial combat, matched with great technical insight. Eventually, they find their man. He has honed his combat skills in Korea, but made his name developing air-to-air tactics at Nellis Fighter Weapons School. His name, Major John Boyd.
At that time, he was known as the Mad Major. He was a guy who was totally focused on air-to-air combat, had dedicated his whole life to first whipping every other fighter pilot in the Air Force and the other services, and secondly, developing theories on how to do that, brilliant new theories that change the way every Air Force in the world flies.
Major Boyd is asked to evaluate the existing Fighter X proposals. The early plans will eventually become the new Air Force fighter.
They brought this uncouth genius to the Pentagon, said, here's what we have for a design, give us your evaluation. And John said, well, I don't know much about airplane design. He said, but I could screw up and do better than this.
Boyd realizes that without a completely fresh start, the Air Force could end up with yet another underperforming plane, like the F-4. Maneuverability must top the list of design specifications. Boyd needs to get his hands on the most powerful computers of the day. The Air Force has rare mainframe machines, but bureaucrats deny him access. Always inventive, Boyd manages to log unofficial time, working after hours. But the Mad Major's erratic behavior makes him enemies inside the Pentagon. One hostile colonel accuses him of stealing $1 million worth of Air Force computer time. To some senior officers, John Boyd would always be a dangerous maverick.
In the end, even though John caused these upheavals and had like unending complaints from every area of the bureaucracy about his behavior and what he was forcing him to do, in the end, the chief of staff always supported him. And he actually arrived at quite a brilliant design.
John Boyd does in fact produce revolutionary design specifications for the new Fighter X. 3 companies are then invited to compete for the chance to build the FX fighter. They have 9 months to create a polished design. By the 1969 deadline, a clear winner emerges. The contract for the new fighter is awarded to the McDonnell Douglas Corporation. In all, 2.5 million man-hours go into the design of the plane. Finally, on June 26, 1972, the first F-15 is rolled out of the St. Louis factory. The following day, the Eagle takes its first flight.
After knots, rotate.
It is immediately clear that this airplane breaks the mold.
The F-15's climb rate was awesome, but it was also an important part of it being an effective interceptor. From standstill, it could reach a height of 30,000 feet, which is the same height as Everest, in a little over 60 seconds.
There has also been a revolution in the cockpit. Equipment is designed to free a pilot from distractions. Whether attacking or defending, a pilot must stay focused on the enemy, not the aircraft's instruments. One radical new design is intended to simplify flight displays. It's known as the HUD.
A HUD is a heads-up display, and it helps us in so many ways because we don't need to look down for any information. Everything that we do and everything that we need to see is right there in front of us. You got your altitude, you got your airspeed, you've got your Mach number, your G's available, the G's that you're actually pulling, what mode you're in, whether you've got a shot on somebody, if you're trying to shoot him with a missile, whether or not you're ready for a bomb to come off. Everything that you need to see is right there in front of you, so you don't have to look anywhere else for it.
While the HUD projects information onto the canopy, the hands-on throttle and stick, or HOTAS system, means a pilot should not have to look down to fire weapons. Something crucial in the heat of battle.
HOTAS was designed to make it easier on the pilot to be more efficient in the cockpit. With HOTAS being that quick and easy to change from different modes, it definitely means a matter of whether you kill your bandit now or you get killed. I think that having the HUD and having HOTAS definitely makes it more strapping the fighter onto you. You become one with the fighter.
Pilots who had flown earlier fighters are immediately impressed with the F-15.
I remember for the first 2 or 3 years that I flew the F-15, having constantly the thought in the cockpit, well, we got this right. Well, we got this right. They were all for different things, and my fellow pilots had the same thoughts. Well, we really fixed this. We really fixed this.
Missile technology is also improving rapidly. But even more important is the way these new missiles work together with the F-15's radar.
You can have good missiles, but if you can't target them with a good radar that maintains the lock, that provides accurate ranging information and engagement information, then they're not a lot of use.
A powerful radar means that air-to-air missiles will be more effective than ever before. If the system works in the heat of battle, it will be the key to the F-15's air supremacy. the Eagle's radar will locate and destroy enemy aircraft before they ever know what has hit them. To Dick Anderegg, this system was a revelation.
In my F-15 checkout, I remember flying home and telling my instructor pilot, who had been in the other airplane, I have over 2,000 hours in the F-4. I have a combat tour in the F-4. I have 2 tours as a fighter weapons school instructor in the F-4. I have just flown my 7th ride in the F-15. I was never as lethal in the F-4 as I am right now after 7 flights in the F-15.
Within 3 years of its first flight, the Eagle has broken multiple records. It takes back all 8 time-to-climb records from the MiG-25, the very fighter it had initially been designed to beat. With performance levels like these, other countries are quick to express interest in acquiring F-15s. Israel is the first foreign power allowed to buy it, and the experience of one Israeli pilot soon proves how durable the F-15 can be. Captain Zvi Nadavi experiences a pilot's worst nightmare when a training exercise goes horribly wrong. He is flying a simulated airfield defense mission and is tasked with intercepting hostile aircraft when disaster strikes.
I saw what in hindsight was the number 3, which is the leader of the rear pair, and he was upside down, and I was at around 14,000 feet, and I shot a missile. Even though he was upside down, he continued to go up, and I was like this, so it was stomach to wing. We couldn't see each other, and we collided. Big commotion, big bang. The A4 basically fireballed immediately, and I found myself with maybe 30 degrees nose down attitude, and the aircraft was spinning. Right after the crash, I told my navigator, prepare to eject, we're going to eject. I opened afterburner, which is a totally opposite instinct when you're spinning towards the ground. Then the roll slowly stopped, and slowly I was able to bring the nose back up. I told my wingman to come close and to inspect me. There was a huge spray of fuel that was being drawn out of the wing, and it basically camouflaged what was going on there.
Nadavi survives the mid-air collision. He is 10 miles out from the nearest airfield and hopes to still land safely. But the pilot cannot see what has happened behind the spray of leaking fuel. His F-15 has been so badly damaged in the collision that he is flying on just one wing. After a devastating mid-air collision, Captain Zvi Nadavi finds himself flying a seriously damaged F-15. Somehow, he is able to regain control over his aircraft and attempt a landing.
I approached the airfield. I crossed the threshold where usually in an F-15 you cross at 130 knots. I crossed at anywhere between 250 to 260 knots. Was landing at approximately twice the normal landing speed. I put the tail hook down. There was a cable at about 1/3 of the runway, and we went into that cable. But because of the speed, the hook is not built for those speeds, and the hook basically tore off the airplane. We stopped maybe 20 feet short of the barrier. As I was running at the last 50 knots, bleeding off, my wingman said, "You're not going to believe what you flew on." And I opened the canopy, and I reached back to shake the hand of the navigator. And as I was reaching back, That was the first time that I looked and I saw that I didn't have a wing on the right-hand side. It's highly likely that if I would have seen it clearly, I would have ejected, because it was obvious you couldn't really fly an airplane like that. I don't think any other aircraft could have taken that amount of damage or that portion of its flight surfaces removed and continued to bring us home safely. The best testament was a good friend of mine who was an F-16 pilot, and he crossed and he saw that there was no wing, and his first words was, "Can I transfer to F-15s?"
It should be aerodynamically impossible for an aircraft to fly with one wing missing. McDonnell Douglas sends a team to investigate the incident.
Their first inclination was it was a taxiing accident. It couldn't happen in air in the airplane. And only when they later went to analyze it and said, okay, the F-15 has a very wide body, and you fly fast enough, then you're like a rocket, then you don't need wings.
The Eagle has done the impossible. If a pilot can land an F-15 with just one wing, the plane should be able to endure unimaginable punishment on the battlefield. But nobody can tell at this stage how well the Eagle will perform against the dreaded MiG-25.
The first good look at the MiG-25 came when a Russian pilot, Viktor Belenko, defected in his MiG-25 to Japan. The Japanese and the Americans hustled over the airplane. They dismantled it on the airfield. And what they saw and what they found was that it was an aircraft that was far less capable than they had originally thought.
MiG-25s look weak on paper, but the Israeli Air Force is the first to challenge them in a real air battle. Since the creation of the modern state of Israel, the Middle East has been torn by bitter wars. One such conflict breaks out in the late 70s as Israel and Syria vie for control over Lebanon. Syria possesses a modern air force with Soviet-supplied planes, MiG-25 Foxbats.
The MiG-25, in my opinion, was a teaser. It was a test, I think, at that time between the Soviet bloc and the US as to whose technology was better.
On June 27, 1979, a group of Israeli Phantoms attacks targets on the Lebanese coast. Just as the Phantoms complete their strikes, they spot Syrian MiGs approaching fast. The enemy fighters will be on top of them in seconds. A flight of Israeli F-15 Eagles is protecting the Phantoms, patrolling the skies above them. They immediately hit their afterburners and streak down towards the hostile MiGs. Each F-15 pilot picks a target and locks on with Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. Seconds later, the Sidewinders rip into the MiGs, instantly vaporizing them. For the first time, American technology is pitted against Russian MiGs. The result is a great victory for the F-15, with the Eagle scoring 5 air-to-air kills on its first day in battle. The F-15 goes on to dominate the skies above the Middle East.
In the Lebanon War, the Israeli Air Force basically shot down over Lebanon close to 80 aircraft. And as far as I recollect, there was no air-to-air losses on the Israeli side.
American pilots can only watch this encounter. They still have not had their chance to fly the F-15 in a real conflict. 10 more years must elapse before American fighter planes are called upon once again. August 2nd, 1990. Saddam Hussein's troops march into Kuwait City, looting and pillaging as they advance. There is also a clear possibility he may order his troops to advance on Saudi Arabia. The U.S. response is swift. Saddam cannot be allowed to threaten Middle Eastern oil supplies. Operation Desert Shield is initiated, and one of the first directives is to deploy 166 F-15s to Saudi Arabia. Their job, protect the northern Saudi oil fields from Saddam Hussein's advancing troops.
As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq.
The F-15 will be critical to the success of the Desert Storm air war. But American F-15 pilots have not yet flown in combat. This is their chance to prove they possess the right stuff. It is 1991, and F-15s are the first planes sent to the Gulf region for Desert Storm. Their job, halt Saddam Hussein's advance and help liberate the people of Kuwait. Ranked against American F-15s is the biggest air force in the Middle East. Saddam controls 550 combat aircraft, including MiG-29 Fulcrums, the latest high-tech Russian-built fighters. In this air war, there is no room for error or confusion. TACC, the U.S. Tactical Air Control Center, draws up a 600-page air tasking order. This document is General Chuck Horner's map for the air campaign. It lists every sortie, every target, every munitions to be used, and every supporting aircraft.
General Horner, he was the designer of the air war, and he worked there in the TACC. He was there every night for, probably 15, 20 hours a day practically. And he or one of his other generals would come to me sometime and ask me F-15E specific questions. For example, can your airplane hit this target? And they'd show me a satellite photo or a map and a target description, and then I'd give them an answer, yes or no. And most of the time I'd look at it and go, sure, that thing's going to return radar. We've got good coordinates where it is. We can hit it.
The goals of the air campaign were first get control of the air, because that enabled all other operations. Then the second goal was to debilitate the Iraqi army so they could not resist our ground forces when they went in to liberate Kuwait. And the third thing we did, which was sort of a side mission, was attack his weapons of mass destruction programs, nuclear, biological, chemical, and the Scud systems that could deliver them.
General Horner assigns two primary roles to the F-15. F-15Cs, the pure air-to-air fighters, will ensure air superiority. The F-15Es, their Strike Eagle cousins, will bomb heavily defended, high-value targets. On January 17, 1991, President George Bush Sr. orders a strike against Iraq. Mike Smith was working in the Tactical Control Center. He communicates with the F-15 squadrons, passing on their target information.
The first few nights, the big concentration was the fixed Scud sites. We wanted to knock out all the fixed Scud sites in western Iraq.
I believe that Israel threatened to use nuclear weapons in retaliation to a Scud attack, say, that carried biological or chemical warhead. And as a result of that, I could see why the immense pressure was put on us about the Scud missiles.
A wall of metal. A wave of F-15 fighters is called upon to sanitize Iraqi airspace ahead of the strike force. The Eagles will be kept busy through the night, fighting at the leading edge of the Desert Storm air battle.
We went in as part of the first wave of 24 F-15Es to go in and strike targets, and our targets were fixed Scud sites along the western border.
Rich Haran's flight speeds towards Iraqi airspace. Before they can cross, a difficult operation must be completed.
One of the scariest things was just air refueling. It was very dark, moonless night, and there were a couple people I had close calls with just potential mid-airs with the tanker and each other as we're doing this.
Careful flying saves the mission from near disaster. But the Eagles still have 200 miles to go before reaching the Scud sites. They now fly very low over the desert and begin targeting long before the Iraqis can even see them. Haran is a weapons systems officer responsible for picking out a missile launch site.
We're about 12 miles out from the target, and the conversation is, this isn't so bad. These guys are asleep. And about that time, all hell breaks loose. And what all hell happens to be is number one's bombs have gone off, and the Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners react to the bombs going off, and the sky is filled with AAA. It is the most impressive fireworks display I've ever seen, which is somewhat the conversation I'm having with the guy I'm flying with, and then the realization that really what I'm looking at is every third to fifth bullet is a tracer. And then it dawns on me the reality of the situation and the fact that they mean us bodily harm.
But Horan stays focused on his radar, successfully identifying the Scud launch site.
What I saw was fixed sight, and as we turned in on the FLIR, our forward infrared scope, you can actually see a tell with a missile on it that our designation is on. We drop our bombs and come off target.
As they come off target, a mighty explosion rocks the Scud site. Horan and his pilot now rejoin the other F-15s. All 24 have made it safely through the target area, but they are still deep within Iraqi territory. Suddenly, a new threat appears on Horan's radar. Could this be one of the feared MiG-29s?
And you can see it flying parallel, offset by several miles to our string of airplanes, and then you see it, what is obviously him running an intercept on our aircraft. We lock him up to let him, for his radar warning receiver, to let him know that he is being looked at, and sort of point at him, hoping to get a reaction or to potentially employ our AIM-9 missile, and then he essentially turns away.
The Iraqi pilot seems reluctant to attack a large flight of F-15s, or is he just waiting for the best opportunity to strike?
At night, I never said I'd be looking behind me, but I was practically unstrapped, standing on the back of the seat, looking to see if this guy was going to run an intercept on us. And probably about a minute or so later, there's a gigantic fireball, and which I believe is his aircraft that's actually hit the ground.
Lacking the F-15's night flying abilities, the Iraqi pilot probably lost control and flew into the desert. It is a decisive night for the American F-15s. The Strike Eagles fought their way in and destroyed their targets, while the air-to-air F-15C models bloodied their talons, shooting down 6 Iraqi aircraft. The F-15 pilots scored the first air-to-air kills from an American Eagle with the opening rounds of Desert Storm. Many Iraqi pilots realize they cannot win and attempt to escape with their planes to Iran. It is a short hop to the safety of the Iranian border, but coalition forces are always vigilant. On one patrol, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dietz spots several Iraqi aircraft making a break for Iran.
We were given a heads up by the AWACS controller that some Iraqi aircraft had taken off from an airfield north of Baghdad. We got within range to shoot at them. We shot before we got into visual range. The initial missiles that we fired were unsuccessful. So we wound up essentially rolling in behind these 4 Iraqi aircraft, about 1.5 miles behind them. Shot them with heat-seeking missiles.
This new generation of missiles has a very high accuracy rate, and Dietz is astonished when he sees his shots miss the Iraqi planes.
I could see the warheads detonate from the missiles, and then the Iraqi aircraft continued to fly. And I was figuring maybe I was snake bit here, that got into such a position and the missiles didn't seem to work. Well, I probably had temporal distortion, because just a few seconds later, a little flame started trickling out the back of the aircraft on the left, and then flame trickling out the back of the aircraft on the right. And just a few seconds later, huge fireball, followed by the second aircraft doing the same thing. At that point, I was just about to pronounce myself the world's greatest fighter pilot, at least in my own mind, when I thought maybe I ought to look around and see if there are other Iraqi aircraft flying around. And I remember as I started looking to the left, right there, not far from me, within a half mile, was an Iraqi aircraft that had his nose pointed out in front of me, which made me initially think, oh, this guy could shoot me with a gun.
Captain Dietz is now dangerously exposed. Could this Iraqi fighter blast him out of the sky? Having shot down one Iraqi fighter, Thomas Dietz then spots another flying straight towards him. He needs to react fast. The enemy might open up with his gun at any second.
So in my mind began going over the maneuver I'd have to do to defeat this threat is when I realized that this was just the front half of an Iraqi aircraft. There was a bunch of flames streaming out the back. The canopy was gone, indicating the pilot had ejected. And I looked over, and there's my wingman behind that aircraft, and he had shot that down.
This pattern of successful shoot-downs repeats itself throughout the Gulf War.
The Iraqi Air Force, I think they were finished in the first 2 or 3 nights. The F-15 was very effective at sweeping them out of the sky. And if they had any airplanes, they weren't flying them.
Only 2 F-15s are lost during Desert Storm, a testament to the skill and training of the Eagle pilots. They fly an amazing 2,400 missions and ensure that the Iraqi Air Force is largely confined to the ground.
The F-15 definitely proved itself in the Gulf War. I think it had a reputation before the Gulf War of being a force you did not want to reckon with. Coming out of the Gulf War, that reputation was clear in everyone's mind worldwide.
Kuwait is liberated and Saddam subdued, but the power struggle in the Gulf region is far from over. The United States Air Force continues to fly over Iraqi airspace on Operations Northern and Southern Watch. For 12 years, they keep a careful eye on Iraq's military activities. Then, suddenly on September 11th, 2001, everything changes.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
It was relatively obvious to me as a combat pilot that we were going to play some role in whatever happened. At that point, obviously, we didn't know where the attacks had come from or who was at fault or even what we were going to do about it. But I was relatively confident that if we were going to take any kind of military action, that F-15Es were going to be part of it, and I was hoping that I'd be able to be part of it as well.
Well, after 9/11, obviously being the first time that we as a country have been attacked on our own soil in quite some time, every country is going to respond when something like that occurs to them. However, I think it's because of the makeup of our country, the fact that we fight for freedom, and 9/11 was an attack against that freedom. It did bring us together, and it brought us together in a very good way.
Before long, F-15s are at the forefront of President George W. Bush's war on terror, helping to hunt down al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
The role of F-15E in Afghanistan was mostly close air support. They were working in close proximity of ground forces, and they relied on the eyes of those guys to find al-Qaeda and be able to determine if there's a good guy or a bad guy.
It is the exceptional range of the F-15E that proves invaluable in the Afghani conflict.
We're hitting targets well beyond the reaches of the Army. We're going to be the long arm of the law.
F-15s also work closely with ground troops, precision bombing targets identified by their Army colleagues. Afghanistan is soon liberated from the repressive Taliban regime, but trouble is brewing elsewhere. The U.S. Air Force has remained active in the Gulf region since Desert Storm. But by 2003, it is clear that Saddam Hussein and President Bush will not reach an agreement over weapons of mass destruction. War breaks out again in early March. In the weeks leading up to the war, the Iraqi Air Force increases its activities. But once hostilities break out, they seem to lack the will to fight.
We thought that there might be a little bit of opposition in the first day or two of the war. So during the first 2 days, 3 days of the war, we parked ourselves right off their airfields, just waiting for them to fly, hoping that they might get airborne and being able to take them down, realizing that if they did get airborne, they were going to be dying right off their own airfield because we were right there ready to shoot them down as soon as they took off.
I'd certainly like to think that after the Iraqi Air Force experience during Desert Storm, that they'd know better than to take off and fight an eagle.
I think it's the first time in warfare that there's been an enemy air force that didn't turn a wheel. And obviously he who hesitates is lost, because once he decided not to fly and they stayed on the ground, the bombers went in and then basically picked them off one by one.
Only the Iraqi pilots can tell us why they did not fly against the coalition forces. Perhaps they hope to preserve their Air Force for future use under a new regime.
One of the things that they were doing, which we weren't quite sure why, they started burying their aircraft in the sand. Maybe they were trying to send a message that they didn't plan on flying, but as they were burying their aircraft in the sand, we continued to take those aircraft out as well.
After assuming air superiority, the F-15s then turned their attention to helping out their Army colleagues on the ground.
We were merely a support asset for the guys on the ground that were going to march from Kuwait to Baghdad. And our job was to move the Iraqi armor out of the way.
It is the Strike Eagle's ability to drop precision laser-guided bombs that will now prove vital.
We encircled Baghdad on a day-to-day basis, 24 hours a day, and rained GBU-12s, for the most part, onto tanks, armor personnel carriers, and even a couple of their airborne assets when we could find them, and effectively made it easy, hopefully, for our Army bros on the ground to march into Baghdad.
This high-tech combination of air and ground forces proves deadly. American troops reached the outskirts of Baghdad just 14 days after the start of the war.
After the past 12 years of doing Operation Northern Watch and Operation Southern Watch, we've wanted to take care of business. And while this was not an excuse to go in and liberate a country, Saddam was a truly evil man, and what he did to that country, he did need to be taken out of the equation. So I'm glad that we had the tools and the leadership to make that happen.
The F-15 played a major part in the defeat of Saddam, but in an unstable world, new conflicts could soon break out. American F-15s are ready to deploy anywhere in the world at a moment's notice.
We want to make sure that we can deter any threat. We're continually making sure that when we go out and train, that we will be the best on the block, that nobody can challenge us, and that every time we go out, we will have air supremacy, that we will own the sky and own the battlefield.
Today, the Eagle reigns supreme, but new fighters are being developed that may one day surpass the F-15's capabilities. Meanwhile, new technology and continuous training will help the Eagles stay at the top of their game.
I want to go out and I want to be able to totally dominate the enemy. If we're going to have a fight, I don't want it to be a fair fight. We want to go out and we want to dominate. And that's why we train as hard as we do to make sure that we can maintain that perfect record of 104-0. As a fighter pilot, you'll never admit that